we've seen a lot of activity with different variants this year. So it's a good segue into our next section, where we're going to look specifically at ransomware and some of the variants that we saw being the most active in the last quarter of last year. So we saw, in our cases, Lockbit was the number one most active. And it's interesting though, because even though it was the number one most active, it was actually less active in the fourth quarter in our numbers than it had been in the third quarter. And we saw the same thing around Black Hat ransomware. And it's kind of interesting. I know specifically with Black Hat, we've kind of attributed, perhaps some of that ebb with their activity related to some disruption that happened in December last year where their site was seized. Unfortunately, with Black Hat, they were able to restore fairly quickly, and they are still posting, as of today, they are still unfortunately posting victims on their website. Now with Lockbit, it was just a couple days ago that we found out about the disruption to Lockbit, and I'm still taking in all the news on it. It seems to be, like probably one of the most comprehensive ransomware disruptions that we've seen to date. And Lockbit was also one of the longest standing ones, that they were active since about 2019. Keith, I know, you're following this law enforcement activity, you're former law enforcement. Was there anything you wanted to add in there about this current activity?
Yeah, first I want to say it was a great thing that law enforcement did collaborated together and took this down from NCA, FBI, all these different countries actually took down Lockbit. Now, that's awesome, right? On the surface, that's amazing. One thing we got to consider that these guys are smart. So some sources I have that are pretty close to some of this stuff tell me the first thing they do is they go for the backups, right? Like you said, Lori, earlier. Another thing that Lockbit and these ransomware groups have, they understand that, right? So they're backing up themselves. So though it's awesome they took everything down, they're disrupting it, the shift from the data is still going to be there. They're backing it up. Unless law enforcement has obtained access to that backup and all those victims, it's still going to be there. Ransomware groups do that. They're experts in their field. This is a business, right? They know how to make money, and that's the overall goal, right? Is the financial gain. So they're going to take that into consideration. And like I said, some of the sources that I talked to are really big into understanding the concept of how to attack someone and then how to prevent it as well. So they're doing cybersecurity measures just as we are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And if you study threat actors, you do see that quite a lot where they are using, basic cybersecurity controls. They're also really good at information sharing. So it kind of exactly what we're doing today. We definitely see threat actors doing that on it's maybe not on webinars, but maybe on forums. But
there needs to be webinars, right? We need to have. The
principle is the same. Yeah, maybe they do have webinars. I don't know. We haven't been invited.
They have marketing campaigns.
Not yet. So, it's interesting. So we have that activity with these larger players, right? And it's kind of like what happens after that. There's always some kind of a ripple effect after a disruption. So we're going to be monitoring that very closely as it relates to Lockbit. But particularly starting in the fourth quarter last year, we did start to see some shifts. And some of those shifts were around, we were seeing more activity with groups like Akira and Play, which we're going to talk about at length in the next section. We're going to go through some case studies there. And we also saw some more activity with Cactus. And Cactus was a group that we first reported on. That was one of our analysts at Kroll, was kind of the first one to identify that as something new and start reporting on that. We published that, I think, in April or May last year. And George, I know you've been following that one, and there's been a lot of evolution with that group in the last few months. Can you kind of talk us through that?
Yeah, Cactus are an interesting group of threat actors, clearly very technically adept. And when we first saw them, they were exploiting Fortinet VPNs with known vulnerabilities. But since then, actors that have deployed Cactus have been seen using a wide variety of other techniques, malvertising, which we've covered quite a lot, to deliver various malwares, including Danabot. They've also exploited other vulnerabilities in SaaS solutions to gain initial access. And so, yeah, I think especially with a lot of these takedowns, we're going to see previous affiliates from other groups, potentially being recruited into these ones. And those groups can really only benefit from that sort of thing. There's less competition in the the threat actor marketplace, essentially. So we're going to keep a really close eye on these guys.
Yeah, so you mentioned, initial access methods there and how we've kind of seen that evolve with respects to Cactus. And we see that with a lot of group because they do use that affiliate model that, there's multiple different ways that they might try to get in. But that's a nice transition to our next section here because we are going to drill in specifically to initial access methods and what we were seeing. So the first slide that we're going to be looking at, you can see here that phishing was the top initial access method that we were seeing reported in our cases at Kroll. And that held true. That was also the same in 2022. So we still see phishing. Unfortunately, it still happens because it works, right? People might be very surprised at that, but part of the reason for it working is because the threat actors that conduct these kind of campaigns are always evolving their tactics. So they know what we're being trained on in the legitimate business side. Hey, watch out for this. And then they're coming up with the next thing that we haven't trained people on. So George, I know you follow the phishing campaigns quite closely. So can you tell us a little bit about the evolutions you saw last year?
Yeah, 2023 was a really interesting year in the sort of the malware market. There were some pretty significant changes made by Microsoft to how the mark of the web works. That directly impacted threat actors' ability to sort of sneak VBA macro code into Word documents and Excel files, things that make really good lures for these sorts of things. And so over the year, we saw a pretty interesting branch of new and novel techniques. We saw the use of OneNote files, which initially weren't directly impacted by those mark of the web changes. And then we started to see threat actors bundle malware with ISO files, password protected zips, using living off the land binaries bundled into those things, all of which designed to bypass mark of the web checks, bypass inline defensive technologies. All of that is a really great way of delivering malware. And we also saw a change in the way that threat actors look to harvest credentials from phishing, right? Detection has improved and come a long way. People's ability to spot a phishing email, I think, on the whole, has probably improved. But threat actors are always looking for ways of bypassing that. And tools like Evil Engine X2, Well, Evil Proxy, all of these actor in the middle frameworks, which are designed to harvest credentials, gather multi-factor authentication requests, and forward those requests onto the service that they're designed to phish for, saw a pretty big increase in 2023. We see that all the time now. And those tokens can live for sometimes up to 90 days, sometimes indefinitely. And we saw a lot of these being delivered using QR code phishing, and we've got some articles on QR code phishing. Some people may call it quishing. That's the last time you'll ever hear me say that. The QR code phishing specifically, we saw a lot, especially in Q4 of last year. There's an example there, redacted on the bottom left-hand side of the screen there. And what is that designed to do? Well, the first thing you do when you see a QR code is you go to scan it with your phone. That, as a victim, immediately removes you from a corporate controlled device or network. And of course, that's also the place that you have your multi-factor authenticator and things like that. It just really streamlines the ability for threat actors to collect those credentials that they're after, collect that MFA token, forward it onto the service, and then resell that access at a later time. So yeah, really interesting changes to the phishing landscape last year.
Thank you for that. So yeah, those QR codes, that's funny. I was at a networking event recently and I couldn't believe everyone was just like had their phone out like with QR codes adding each other. And I guess as the security professional there, I was very concerned with all those QR codes going around.
It's addictive. You have to do it. It's so addictive to just go up there. Yeah. What is
So hopefully no one pulled their phone out to scan that QR code. But so we're looking here on this graph, we're looking at initial access across all of our Kroll cases. Now, one thing you may notice here is that we actually saw a decline overall in external remote services. So some of you may be wondering, well, why is Kroll focusing on external remote services for the briefing today if they saw a decline in it? And the next slide, if we flip over there, that's kind of shows a good reason why we are focusing on it today. So I mentioned earlier, you know, when we look at ransomware cases, we do find those to be the most impactful, unfortunately, for clients. And that is where this slide here is looking at initial access specifically by ransomware cases. And you can see by far for those cases, those methods to get in time and time again in our forensic investigations, they unfortunately trace back to either open RDP or a threat actor potentially accessing a virtual private network or VPN. In some cases, they're doing that with valid accounts where there's no MFA that's enforced on that. So they're able, you know, couple those accounts from the dark web or from an info stealer, and they're able, unfortunately, to get right into the network. Another thing with remote services that's probably driving this number up is that we've seen a lot of, unfortunately, significant vulnerabilities related to those appliances and various software in the past few months. So George, can you tell us about some of the ones that you're following or some of the specifically critical CVEs that are related to these VPNs?
Yeah, there is, well, I don't even know the number, but a lot of very impactful vulnerabilities towards the end of last year, especially. We saw a lot of zero-day vulnerabilities or end-day vulnerabilities being exploited very quickly after initial disclosure. So for those 0 days, typically there was one group exploiting it. It got reported, and then others were quickly able to copy some exploit code or produce a POC very quickly. And then they were very quick to leverage that. We saw that used against Fortinet VPNs. Of course, the Citrix Bleed suite of vulnerabilities. Many of the groups that we've been talking about today had sort of initial access task forces, which were, you know, just going around owning as many of those devices as possible, and then giving that access on to ransomware operators who could take that initial access and move laterally. And we also had some very significant vulnerabilities affecting Cisco products as well. Cisco iOS, which impacted tens of thousands of devices, and ASA appliances as well. So yeah, for a threat actor, there's a lot of exploit code to choose from and a lot of surface to attack.